The fog hadn't lifted yet when the truck's headlights swept across the gravel drive, cutting two pale beams through the mist like something out of a memory. It was 5:15 in the morning, the kind of hour where the world still belongs to roosters and the sound of tires on wet stone. The truck bore the faded logo of Colby Brothers Lumber Mill, its bed loaded with something most people would call trash. Walnut offcuts, twisted ends, knotted slabs, oddly angled cuts too small or too strange for any standard order. The driver backed up to the old barn, hit the lever, and let it all spill out in a clattering heap. Wood tumbling over wood, dust rising into the headlights like smoke from a fire that never quite caught. A man was already standing there waiting. He always was. Ben Turner was 58 years old, with hands like dried river clay and a face that had spent 6 decades outdoors. He wore the same canvas coat he'd worn for as long as anyone could remember, and he watched the offcuts fall the way another man might watch snow settle on a field, patient, almost reverent, like he was witnessing something nobody else could see. He didn't say much to the driver. He never did. Just a nod, a lifted hand, and then he was already crouching by the pile, running his palm across the grain of a twisted piece of walnut no wider than a dinner plate. This had happened every week for 12 years. 12 years of trucks arriving before sunrise. 12 years of Ben sorting through wood that everyone else considered worthless. 12 years of a barn slowly filling with pieces too strange to sell and too small to matter, at least to anyone who wasn't looking closely enough. Nobody in town understood why he kept it. Nobody asked him directly either. But more than one neighbor had slowed their truck along the county road just to squint at the growing stacks behind Ben's barn and wonder quietly what exactly the old farmer thought he was doing. If you've ever watched someone hold on to something everyone else had given up on, you already know there's a story hiding in that patience. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone turn overlooked material into something nobody expected? To understand why the mill even bothered hauling that walnut out to Ben's property, you'd have to understand what nobody wanted it for in the first place. Walnut offcuts, the twisted ends and narrow ribbons left over after a mill cuts its standard boards, are unpredictable. They warp unevenly and carry knots that ruin a table saw's rhythm. A furniture factory wants uniform grain and consistency. It can run through a machine 1,000 times without surprise. These pieces offered none of that. By every commercial measure, they were garbage. "We used to just burn it," the mill's manager, a heavy-set man named Dale Whitcomb, admitted once, leaning against his truck with a cigarette he never quite lit. Ben asked if he could take it instead. Didn't cost us nothing to say yes. So they said yes, every week, without asking what he wanted it for. Ben's neighbor, a wiry, sharp-tongued man named Earl Prentice, had opinions about it, the way certain neighbors always do. "You're gonna run out of barn before you run out of scrapwood, Turner," Earl said one afternoon, watching Ben stack another load by size and grain pattern, like he was cataloging a museum collection instead of sorting garbage. "Might," Ben said, not looking up. "What in the world are you even doing with it?" Ben just smiled the way he always did when a question didn't need an answer yet. He wiped sawdust from his hands, looked at the sky like it might rain, and went back to work. It became a kind of ritual, though nobody called it that at the time. Ben ran his thumb along each offcut, feeling for where the grain shifted, marking pieces with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. Straight-grained boards went on one side of the barn. Burled, knotted, twisted pieces went on the other, stacked with a care that made Earl shake his head every time he drove past. It didn't bother Ben. He'd long since stopped needing anyone to understand. What none of them knew, not Earl, not Dale, not even most of Ben's own family, was that this wasn't the beginning of something strange. It was the return of something old. 40 years earlier, a much younger Ben Turner had spent 3 years as an apprentice in a small furniture workshop 2 counties over, learning from a master craftsman named Walton Reese. Ben had loved it. The smell of fresh-cut oak, the sound of a hand-plane gliding clean, the quiet satisfaction of turning raw timber into something a family would keep for generations. Then his father got sick. The farm needed hands, and furniture making doesn't pay a mortgage the way 300 acres of soybeans does. Ben came home and never went back, not because he stopped loving it, but because some men learn to fold their dreams up small enough to carry quietly, without complaint, for the rest of their lives. Walton Reese had written him a letter that year, the only one Ben ever kept. It said in Walton's cramped handwriting that talent like Ben's didn't disappear just because circumstances changed. It only waited. Ben folded that letter into the bottom of a toolbox and didn't read it again for nearly 30 years. But he never threw it away either. Nobody in town remembered that Ben Turner had once wanted to be a furniture maker. Ben had almost forgotten it himself. Almost. Every evening after the cattle were fed and the equipment put away, Ben would walk out to the barn with a lantern and sit at the workbench he'd built years before. At first, it was small things: a cutting board for his late wife's sister, a stool for his granddaughter, Emma, barely 7 then, who would sit for hours watching sawdust curl off the plane like it was the most interesting thing she'd ever seen. She was too young to understand what he was building. She wasn't too young to understand that it mattered. Then it became something more. He began matching pieces. A warped offcut here, a burled knot there. The way a man solves a puzzle he spent a lifetime studying without realizing it. Walnut forgives almost nothing in a factory, but in patient hands willing to work with its imperfections instead of against them, it becomes something no machine could replicate. A retired mill worker named Hollis Dunbar, who'd spent 31 years grading lumber before his knees gave out, stopped by one evening to drop off a part for Ben's tractor. He found Ben sanding a low table built from 3 mismatched slabs, the grain flowing between them like it had always belonged together, and ran his hand across it the way men who understand wood do instead of talking. "You know what this is?" Hollis finally asked. "Just a table," Ben said. Hollis shook his head slowly. "No. This is what happens when somebody actually looks at the wood instead of just cutting it." It was the first time in years anyone had said something like that to Ben. He didn't show it on his face, but something in him held on to those words a little longer than he let on. Maybe you know what it's like to set something you loved aside for the people who needed you more, to fold up a dream small enough to carry quietly for years, the way Ben did. If that sounds familiar, you already understand this story better than most. Stick around, and if you'd like, subscribe for more of them. The furniture stayed mostly inside the family for years: a dresser for Emma's room, a bench for the church, a dining table Ben gave his niece as a wedding gift. Word moved slowly through a small town, the way it always does. A compliment here, a passed-along photograph there. It might have stayed that way forever if not for Claire Whitfield, an interior designer hired to furnish a farmhouse-style bed and breakfast an hour from Ben's property. A friend of Emma's had posted a photo online of a walnut side table Ben had built. A quick snapshot, bad lighting, an object nobody had thought twice about. Claire couldn't stop looking at it. She drove out unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting a showroom or at least a proper workshop. What she found instead was a converted barn, morning light falling in long strips through gaps in the siding, dust hanging suspended in the air, like something caught between one moment and the next. She stopped talking before she'd finished her sentence. In front of her stood a chest of drawers built from walnut, so richly figured it looked lit from within. Dark heartwood bleeding into pale sapwood, in patterns no two boards could repeat. Joints fitted so tightly, they seemed grown together rather than cut and assembled. She ran her fingers along a seam where two grain patterns met so cleanly, it looked intentional. Because it was. The finish was hand-rubbed, not glossy or factory perfect, the kind that made people want to touch it twice just to be sure the first time was real. "Who taught you to do this?" she finally managed. "Man named Walton Reese," Ben said. "Long time ago." Claire didn't say much else that day. She photographed the tables, the benches, the raw slabs still drying against the far wall, each one seeming to hold a story nobody had bothered asking about until now. She left with a feeling she couldn't quite explain, the sense of having stumbled onto something the rest of the world hadn't caught up to yet. Within a month, 3 of Ben's pieces were sitting in the lobby of that bed and breakfast. Within 3 months, guests were asking where they could buy furniture just like it. The first person to actually pay Ben for a piece was a young couple, furnishing their first house, choosing a simple dining table and running their hands over the surface like they couldn't quite believe farmland could produce something this fine. Ben folded the check into his shirt pocket and didn't look at it again until that evening, alone in the barn, the number staring back like proof of something he hadn't quite let himself believe. They came back 4 months later for a matching set of chairs, and Ben remembered their names before they said them. Growth, when it finally came, didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived the way most real things do, slowly, then steadily, then all at once. Local orders turned into custom commissions. Claire connected him with a boutique hotel chain looking for furniture with what she called honest character, the largest order Ben had ever taken on, 14 pieces delivered within 10 weeks. 3 weeks before the deadline, the old planer Ben had used since his apprenticeship seized up entirely, its motor burning out with a smell that filled the barn. There was no money for a replacement, no time to wait for one to ship. Hollis Dunbar showed up the next morning without being asked, bringing hand planes he hadn't touched in years, and techniques Walton Reese had taught him decades earlier. "Slower," Hollis said, watching a curl of walnut fall to the floor. "But it never breaks down on you." Curtis, recently hired for deliveries handy with small engines, got the old motor running again, and the order shipped 3 days ahead of schedule. Ben never told the hotel chain how close it had come to falling apart. For the first time, Ben let himself wonder, quietly, whether he'd taken on more than a farmer with a barn full of scrapwood was meant to carry. The doubt didn't last long. He'd remember Walton's letter, kept now in a kitchen drawer instead of the bottom of a toolbox, and go back to work. Emma was 12 that year, old enough to hand him tools instead of just watching him use them. She started coming out most evenings after homework, sweeping sawdust and stacking offcuts the way she'd watched him do since she was small enough to sit on a bucket. Ben never pushed her toward it. He simply let her be there, until wanting to learn became its own invitation. Ben couldn't keep up alone anymore, and for the first time in his life, he hired help. Curtis, full-time now. Rosa, a hobbyist woodworker who'd never gone professional. And eventually 2 more craftspeople drawn by word that a farmer 2 counties over was building something worth being part of. The first time Ben wrote payroll checks instead of paying himself whatever was left over, he sat at the kitchen table a long while before signing them. They outgrew the barn within the year, adding a pole building with the county's help. The first order that crossed a state line arrived almost by accident. A designer in Ohio asking, almost apologetically, whether Ben shipped furniture outside the region. He hadn't, not once, but he figured it out anyway. When that shipment left the barn, Ben stood in the driveway and watched it travel further than any piece of his furniture ever had, and understood, for the first time, this had stopped being a hobby. Dale Whitcomb drove out one afternoon, not to dump another load, but to talk business. "Heard you're going through Walnut faster than we're cutting it," he said, standing in a workshop that barely resembled the barn he remembered. "We could set aside the good offcuts for you. Proper selection, not just whatever we're throwing out." Ben nodded slowly. "I'd appreciate that, Dale." What had started as waste nobody wanted had become premium material a mill was proud to supply. A trade magazine ran a short feature that spring, and orders began arriving from places Ben had never been. None of it changed how he spent his mornings. Still walking the barn at first light. Still measuring twice out of habit rather than necessity. To Ben, it was simply proof that patience, given enough time, tends to get noticed. What do you think was Ben's greatest strength through all of this? His patience, his skill, his vision, or his persistence? Let us know in the comments which one you'd choose. The years that followed weren't dramatic. There was no overnight transformation, no headline-making moment. Just steady growth. One honest piece of furniture at a time, until the small operation that once fit inside a farm barn became a business generating more than $2 million a year. But if you ask Ben about the money, he'll change the subject within a sentence or two. It was never really about the number. It was about a barn full of wood nobody believed in, and a man who remembered, quietly, patiently, what he'd once dreamed of becoming. These days, the original barn still stands, added on to twice now. Ben still walks through it most mornings before the crew arrives, running his hand along the benches the same way he once ran his hand along a pile of discarded walnut in the pale hours before sunrise. His granddaughter, Emma, grown now, works beside him most days, sanding the surface of a new table built from 3 mismatched slabs of walnut, the same style Hollis Dunbar once stopped to admire all those years ago. "Emma," Ben said one morning, watching her run her thumb along a burled section she could have easily cut away and hadn't. "Why'd you keep that piece? Most folks would have thrown it out." She didn't look up right away. "Because you taught me nobody throws away the interesting part, Grandpa. That's usually the best part." Ben didn't say anything back. He didn't need to. He just nodded, the way he always had, and let the moment settle the way sawdust settles once the saw goes quiet. Outside, a truck pulls up the gravel drive, headlights cutting through the morning fog. It's not the same truck. It doesn't carry the same cargo either. Where it once dumped waste nobody wanted, it now delivers carefully selected walnut, chosen specifically for the man who taught an entire town that value isn't always obvious at first glance. Sometimes it's buried under 12 years of patience, waiting for someone willing to look a little closer than everyone else. That's the kind of story worth remembering, not because of what it earned, but because of what it proves. That the things the world throws away aren't always worthless. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right person to see them differently. If this story moved you, come back soon. There are more stories like Ben's waiting to be told, about ordinary people who quietly did extraordinary things.